This meeting is being recorded.
Good
This
afternoon.
meeting is being recorded.
Good afternoon. This is Paul Gilje. Happy to have you on our latest Rolette reunion recording for 2026. Blessings to all of you. We are today very privileged to have Bernie Haroldson, resident of Eureka, California, and a great-grandson of T.K. Bakken and Thuri Bakken, to visit with us about his family. Bernie has prepared detailed notes for this discussion today and will be carrying us through on a very organized process. And I guarantee you're going to find some interesting aspects about this very early family in Rolette County. One of the earliest, not the absolute, but one of the earliest. And they've got quite a good story to tell. And so we will now start sharing. And Bernie, you're on, so go to it.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Well, as Paul said, my name is Bernie Haroldson, and I am the great-grandson of Torger Knut, or T.K. Bakken, and his wife, Thuri Bakken. Thuri was my great-grandmother, and her sister, Bessie, was Paul Gilje's grandmother. And it's through Thuri that I'm related to all of you. My source for most of the information I have on the Bakkens and the details I'm presenting here about their emigrating from Norway to North Dakota came from the first-hand account of Torger Bakken. In the 1930s, the government funded a project named the, quote, Historical Data Project, unquote, to record the histories of some of the European pioneer settlers to the Rolette area from the late 1800s. Since this history project was done in the 1930s, this would have been about 50 years after the early pioneers settled in the area in the late 1800s. I suppose they wanted to get these stories firsthand from these early settlers, before they all died off. Paul Gilje obtained this material and sent it to me some time back. In preparing this presentation, I relied on the information about Torger and Thuri Bakken's life based on the recollections of Torger Bakken as were transcribed in writing from an interview with him in about 1939. Paul, I'm just thinking now, you had some slides from Norway, and I think I was supposed to give you space for those. Do you?
Yeah, this was provided by Skeeters Fridland and TK's grandson, or his husband, and one of the granddaughters, and he sent me the information he had, and this happens to be the birthplace of TK Bakken in Setesdal, near Vala in central Norway.
Okay, and then you had this is, well, we'll get to that one. We'll get to that one here in a little bit. Well, regarding this interview that was done in the late 30s, did you have that slide of the Historical Data Project here?
Yes, right there.
Oh, that's it. Okay, that's the that's actually the handwritten biography that I used as a large excerpts of that in this presentation that I'm giving now.
That's right.
Well, anyway, when I read that biography, I realized that the interview with Torger Bakken told their story in a far better way than I could. My great-grandmother Thuri had died some years earlier to when this interview was recorded. And I believe their daughter Anna may have been present when the interview occurred. And I think, Paul, we also have information that a couple of her sisters were there.
Well, the best of our knowledge is that both Bessie and Margit, Bessie was there. Margit was deceased by that time, but Bessie was there.
Okay. So they probably helped him recall some of these incidents. And I believe their daughter Anna would have been my great aunt. may have been present when the interview occurred. The information from the interview was recorded in handwritten form, and Paul showed you that beginning of that biography there a moment ago. It was recorded in handwritten form by a member of this history project, a Wilhelmina Langness. She titled her document, quote, Biography of Torger Bakken, unquote. She signed it and noted that she was a, quote, field worker, historical data project, Rolette, North Dakota. Unfortunately, she didn't, the year isn't there. We know the dates, the interview was done over the last couple days of August and I think maybe September 1st, but we think this was done probably sometime between 1936 and 1939. I'm going to read now from this 7-page biography. I'm going to start on page 2. On July 1st, 1880, he, referring to Torger, married Miss Thuri Bakken in Norway. They were born and raised, both of them, in Norway. Their reasons for coming to America was to gain a home for themselves. In Norway, wages were small and farms were small, and a bare living was all he could make. He was attracted to America by letters from a friend by the name of Drank Rushland of Buxton, North Dakota. From him, he heard of the free land in America, and consequently, Mr. and Mrs. Bakken decided to come to America. The Bakkens had disposed of their furniture, cow, and farm implements. The only things they brought along was clothing. The trip on the ocean was uneventful, with the exception of a very bad storm in mid-ocean. And they, with other immigrants who came on the same ship and were going to various parts of the U.S., were hurried to immigrant trains and taken out of New York City to their destinations in various parts of the country. Now, Paul has just put on a slide here of a structure, and I researched this because I got thinking, most of us, when we think about immigrants coming to America at this time, we think of Ellis Island, that is, if they came through New York and entered New York Harbor. But actually, if your ancestor came here prior to 1890, they probably came through this facility here called Castle Garden at the very southern tip of Manhattan, in what the area known as the Battery of Manhattan. And on this early photograph, you can see that it's right on the edge of the harbor, and there's actually, well, I don't think you can see them here, but there were some waterways right around it. And then he has a second slide that's a painting of this same structure, this castle garden structure. And it was used for processing immigrants, I believe, from 1855 to 1890. And it was probably a military outpost before that. So that's just a little aside here about where the immigrants came in during that time. Okay, back to the narrative. Let's see. Okay. Mr. and Mrs. Bakken and Margaret, I know I must have skipped something here. No, let's see. Anyway, they made their trip without any companions from Norway. So they're, even though the ship was probably filled with immigrants, they didn't travel as a group or other people they knew from back home. It was just their family, and they took the train. I don't know if they were accompanied by other Norwegian immigrants headed also for North Dakota. There's no account of any specific names given here. Anyway, so they arrived at Buxton territory, Dakota territory. Now, the notes, she actually used the word Dakota territory, and Paul has a slide up here now that shows at least the North Dakota part of Dakota territory. And Dakota territory actually included both Dakotas. We have to remember that prior to 1889, North Dakota was a territory, not a state. So in 1889, North Dakota became a state. And I'm assuming probably at that same time or shortly thereafter, South Dakota became a state. He continued to work on the farm. He worked on the farm of this a couple different people during a couple-year period. He continued to work on the farm. Now, they arrived in 1883, and after a 19-day trip on the ocean, and then a 4-day train ride from New York to Buxton, North Dakota. Buxton, North Dakota is located right along current Interstate 29. I think it's within 20 or 30 miles south of Grand Forks. Then he got, quote, land fever, unquote. Back to the narrative here. On May 27th, 1885, Mr. Bakken, Mr. Ragnestad, that's the person whose farm he was working on, and Knut Torgerson left for the west to look for land. Mrs. Bakken and the children remained at the Ragnestad farm. The party of land seekers made their trip by ox team. They camped and cooked their meals by campfire. The oxen rested and grazed near the camp. They took the stage road. Mr. Bakken, Knut Torgerson, and well, it just says Mr. Bakken and Knut Torgerson, and Kjetil Ragnestad, Kjetil, K-J-E-T-T-L-E, Ragnestad, arrived in Rolette County June 2nd, 1885. And just as an aside here, they left on May 27th, so that trip took about 5 days by ox team, camping at night and so forth. And out of curiosity, I went into Google Maps and looked up, did the route from Buxton, North Dakota to Rolette. And using today's roads, they rate the trip as 171 miles, taking about 3 hours by car. So what you can do today in 3 hours, probably not counting stops, took them about 4 or 5 days to do by ox team. This shows the distances, how the distances become much longer in those days once you left the rail lines. You could go halfway across the country in 4 days, but once you got on horse-drawn travel, then, 170 some miles could take multiple days. As we know, there was no railroad service to Rolette, and I think in an earlier presentation in this series, we learned about Rolette, the railroad coming to Rolette in 1905. They sighted the shack of a settler on Section 4 of Leonard Township and turned their oxen in that direction. Arriving there, they found the Charles Reinstad family living there. They came in 1884. That would have been a year before this event. Mr. Reinstad was the first settler in the Leonard Township area. Mr. Reinstad's place became the stopping place for travelers and land seekers. And maybe you could show that next slide of a township map, Paul.
Yes. Yes.
The one, yeah, that one. This is a blank township. Some of you may not be familiar when they talk about townships and legal descriptions and so forth. But this is a classic township, and a township is defined by a square 6 miles by 6 miles. And then within that square, you see numbers running from 1 to 36, and that would be a section within a township. So a section is 1 mile by 1 mile square. That contains 640 acres. A square mile is 640 acres of land. So a half section would be 360, a quarter, 160 acres, and so forth. And you'll notice this numbering system, which again is universal with each township. It starts in the upper right-hand corner and goes right to left, going through section 6, and then drops down to 7 and goes back, and it follows that pattern like in a serpentine or snake-like pattern until you have all sections numbered. So I just put this up for illustration because we're going to have we're going to be identifying some properties here in a minute. So anyway, it was Mr. Reinstad, back to the narrative, Mr. Reinstad who took the land seekers around and helped them to get their land located. In 1885, the government offered what she wrote down here as preemption, Preemption, preemption and tree claims, two different kinds of claims to settlers. Each claim comprising 160 acres of land, or in other words, a quarter of a section. Mr. Bakken located a piece of land in the Shell Valley Township, a preemption northeast quarter of section 33. There's a map he's got up now. And that was the tree claim, and the southwest quarter of section 27. And you can see here, I've highlighted, you can see if it's a little small on your screen perhaps, but there in section 27, you'll see a colored section in the lower left-hand or southwest quarter of that section. And then another adjacent touching at the corners, another quarter section of land in the upper northeast quarter of section 33. So this is a blow up of a section map. You see it only covers, some of the sections, but you can see that the bottom row of the section would be the bottom mile of that 6 mile square. And it's right above Leonard Township, which we'll get to in a minute. You might show that. Why don't you just show that one now, Paul? The
Sure.
township, the Leonard Township, which would be right to the south of this one. And this will, oops.
You need a better assistant, I think, Bernie.
There you go. Now here we have the upper section. This is so Shell Valley Township would just be north of that. That bottom row in the slide previous would be just basically north of this. And what I've got colored here is this shows the family connections, how some of us were linked and were basically neighbors. This, you see the orange section, you'll see, I think there's maybe 3 or 4 parcels there. I can't read them, but the yellow ones are a combination. Most of those are different Giljes. What are the names again, Paul? Enoch.
Over in the far left, that little one is Peder Gilje, and that's where TK's niece, Margit, Thuri's sister, lived. Margit married Peder Gilje, and that's in that corner. Then to the right of that, where you see E. Gilje, that's Enoch Gilje, my grandfather. Then to the right of him is Lars Gilje, and that's brother of Enoch's wife, Anna. And it's in this same section where Enoch is, or where Lars is where the Westland Church is, just slightly north of the name Lars. Then to the lower right of that is a Torger, who went back to Norway, homesteaded, but then went back to Norway. He was a brother of Anna. And then to the left of that is T. Gilje, and that's Thorvald, and he was also a brother of Anna. So these here, the ones in orange, were all closely related. Then to the right of that,
and then the blue one, the one that's kind of the odd shaped, the larger blue one right below that yellow, those orange ones, that's Paul Tastad. He owned that.
That was my mother's father.
Right. And then you see another little blue one there to the left of that. Looks like a quarter section. That was a beaver. Was that Andrew Beaver or
Andrew Beaver? That's Randy Lee's relative there.
So you see how these people were all within a mile or so of each other.
Yeah.
And then there's that orange one or a yellow one right up in the corner there. And there was some mystery about that, but it turns out, and I just found this out I was talking with the Rolette County recorder just this past week. And my great-grandfather, Torger Bakken, did for a time own this, at least part of this that's in yellow. But then I also know that he didn't own it after 1913. Anyway, that also it kind of shows how these families, how they were connected back in the day. Okay. Let's see, I'm going to get back to the narrative here. Okay, they found the land we've located, we've showed that. Continuing with the narrative, Mr. Bakken, Mr. Torgerson, and Mr. Ragnarsad drove, now they have located this land, okay? And now the next day, they drove their oxen to Dunseith and filed on the above named quarters. So you had to file your claim. And the agency, the entity where you did that at that time was in Dunseith. And they did that on June 4th, 1885. On June 5th, they started back with their oxen to Buxton, North Dakota, arriving there June 13th. Mr. Torgerson and Mr. Ragnarsad did not file on land in Rolette County. So they either went along just to check it out or to see what their neighbor was going to be living, or for whatever reason, but we don't really hear any more about them. Mr. Torgers, okay, Mrs. Bakken started immediately. Mr. and Mrs. Bakken started immediately to make preparations for their new home. They're back in Buxton now after he's just filed on this land. They made a cover for their wagon of canvas. They carried all their belongings in this wagon, such as a cook stove, clothing, dishes, and bedding. A box of 4 chickens was tied to the back of the wagon. The cows followed up the rear, tied behind the wagon. They started from Thompson, North Dakota on June 21st, 1885. They slept in the covered wagon and lit campfires to cook their meals by. They slept in the covered wagon and lit campfires to cook their meals by. The cows provided them with milk. They carried their supply of food with them in the wagon. And you know, when I was reading this the first time, it's like I'm reading a script from a movie.
Yeah.
We've all seen enough Westerns to know about canvas covered wagons, cows being pulled behind a wagon, and people camping out at night. And I'm thinking this isn't just a movie. This is actually the history of my family, and no doubt your families probably have similar stories, because this was the mode of how this area was developed at that time. Mr. and Mrs. Bakken and children Margaret and Birgit, I forgot to mention, they did have a second child born their first year in North Dakota. And so they had 2 children at this time. Mr. and Mrs. Bakken and children Margaret and Birgit arrived at the Charles Reinstead shack July 1st. That was the settler they found their first trip there. They remained there at that home site until July 10th, during which time Mr. Bakken, with the help of Charles Reinstead, built their first home. The first home was built into the side of a hill. Now, this is another, I'm going back to the Little House on the Prairie books here, and I'm seeing that this was actually my history, and probably your history for some of you. The first home was built into the side of a hill. The sides and front were of logs. The roof, a peaked roof, or I'd call it a pitched roof, had poles laid across a large log for a center beam. The poles they covered with hay, and turf was placed thereon, or sod, over the straw on top of these poles to keep it warm in winter and cool in the summer. The logs Mr. Bakken and Mr. Reinstead cut and hewed from the Turtle Mountains. The distance to the Turtle Mountains was 12 miles. Now, I imagine they had to make a few trips. I don't think on a wagon you could haul all the logs to build a house, but just the work that these people went through. On July 10th, 1885, the Bakkens moved into their new home. Now, if these dates are correct, they built this house in 10 days or so. Mr. Bakken broke up 10 acres that summer. And on August 5th, so less than a month after he moved into the house, and during which time he somehow broke up 10 acres of ground. Or maybe he did it after he got back, not sure. He returned to Thompson, Dakota Territory to assist Shettle Ragnestad with harvest and thrashing. So he had left the farm to go take his family to this new claim they had. He built a home, left them in it, and I don't know what that would have been like. I'm trying to picture a mother with 2 young children being left in a town that's still, I mean, a town would be maybe too much to even call it, with whatever provisions they had, while he trekked back to work on the harvest on the farm where they were living. So he goes back to assist Ragnestad with harvest and thrashing. Mrs. Bakken and children were left at the claim during the time Mr. Bakken was at Thompson, earning money for the family's winter supply of provisions. Mr. Bakken returned home to his family September 15th, 1885. So he was there maybe 3 weeks or more. The next spring, no mention of that winter, but the next spring in 1886, Mr. Bakken broke up 10 more acres of land. He put 20 acres all into wheat. The first crop amounted to 400 bushels of good wheat. This was in 1886. The next year, 1887, the crops dried up. There was no harvest. He continued to break up the farm with his oxen, but the crops were very poor. In 88 and 1889, his crop froze before it was ripe. He threshed 400 bushels of very poor grade wheat. He had this wheat made into flour at Godbrecht's flour mill at Dunseith. It made very poor grade flour. The year 1890 was a good year, finally. Mr. Bakken had 100 acres under cultivation. So even though he wasn't making any money, he continued to break up land. You know, he's just always, you know, pushing toward tomorrow. Pioneer spirit. So 1890, the weather conditions improved, frosts were less frequent, and there was more rainfall. Crop conditions improved. In 1887, Mr. Bakken erected a new home of logs. So that's kind of an aside here. It was 14 by 16 feet and had 2 windows and 1 door. Pretty basic, pretty small. I must have missed something here where he has this year where he has really good, maybe that's coming later. Anyway, so he builds this new house. In 1902, a few years later, he built an addition to his log house. The addition was 14 by 18. I actually doubled the size of the house. He erected a 2-story frame house and a barn 40 feet long and a granary 30 feet long. Now, Paul just put up a slide of that. That's the barn. I'm guessing that could be the barn that he erected. And the other thing, I don't know, it mentions a granary. If you go to the next slide, I'm not sure I don't think that was a granary. I think that might be another barn or something that was referred to as a garage later, but that looks more like a place maybe where you would store implements or something. Anyway, some of you can comment on that maybe when I'm finished here. Mr. Bakken, now remember this interview was done in the 1930s. It says, Mr. Bakken still lives on this farm. The buildings are still there. There is a photo taken, we think in 1975, and you can see that same barn there. The photo that Paul showed earlier, those color photos, I took those. I took those in 2020 when I was back there, visited, and Dwayne Christensen, my second cousin, took me around and showed me these things. But these are pictures from 1975. Where's the other one, Paul? Do we go to those next? I can't, no, don't. We'll go to, yeah, that's later.
Yeah.
Okay. A garage was added with the advent of the automobiles. His son Oscar, again, this is the 1930s, still lives on that farm with his father. Mrs. Bakken, Thuri Bakken, passed away, we think about 1901. And Margit Bakken, their second child, died March 10th, 1902. There were 9 children born to Mr. and Mrs. Bakken, all living, this again is the late 30s, except for Birgit. And I'm going to skip down and read the final paragraph of the biography portion. This is just some miscellaneous notes. Mr. Charles Reinstad carried the mail and drove the stage from Island Lake to Dunseith in 1887. Mr. Charles Beaver was the first postmaster at Island Lake. He served there in 1887. The names of the children of Torger and Thuri Bakken in order of birth are Margaret Bakken Whalen. I'm giving their married names when married. 1881, that was the only child born in Norway. Birgit Bakken, 1884, but died in Rolette at age 8 in 1902. Hilda Bakken Garden, born in 1885. Nellie Bakken Golden, 1886. So they had children 3 years in a row there. Lena Bakken Haraldson, that would be my grandmother, born 1890. Knut Bakken, now we finally get some boys, born in 1893, and Oscar Bakken, born in 1895. Anna Bakken Christensen, born in 1896, and Tilde Bakken Fridlin, 1900. And now there's some slides that Paul can show here. The first one is the Bakken family as it existed. I think you skip down to go back to that one. That one shows there's a Torger. You can see the man, the one adult there is the man, and Thuri is where did you say she is, Paul, in that slide?
Seated right to his left.
Okay, yeah, she's kind of hunched down a little bit.
Right. Yeah.
And then the children at that time around her. I think my grandmother, Lena, is the one in the front row on the left with the wide white collar. Is that right, Paul? I think that's her.
They're all identified below there.
Yeah, but we won't take time here to go through all those. So other than now getting to my personal knowledge of things, everything above here, of course, is coming from this information from this data project. Other than my grandmother, Lena, I only knew 2 of the siblings, the children of Torger and Thuri Bakken. And these were my great aunts, Tilde and Nellie. I also have known some of their children and grandchildren. I was born in the Minneapolis area and lived there until the summer before my 6th grade in 1956, when my family moved to California. And one tidbit of being part of this reunion group, I learned that Jeff Epnick's family also lived in La Habra during some of the years that my family lived there. Of course, we never knew them then. And I've often wondered if my family and Jeff's might have been the only families living in that town that had roots in Rolette, North Dakota. But who will ever know? It would have been nice to know back then. But that's what it is. When I lived in Minneapolis, up until 6th grade, my grandmother, my grandma Lena also, she lived there. I saw Tilde a couple times a year when she would travel by train from Barnesville, Minnesota, a small town about 25 miles southeast of Fargo, North Dakota. Her sister, Nellie Bakken Golden, also lived in Barnesville. And we would see her when she and her husband, Henry Golden, were in the Twin Cities occasionally, or when we visited Barnesville, which we did about once a year. I remember hearing the names of my grandma's sisters, Hilda and Anna, and her brother, Knut, but I never met any of them. Since learning more about my Bakken relatives through Paul Gilje's tireless documentation. I have met Sharon Langehoud, the daughter of my great aunt, Anna Bakken Christensen, and Dwayne Christensen, Anna's grandson, and my second cousin. I've also met and corresponded with Dwayne Christensen's son, Brent Christensen, and these would be his great-great-grandparents that we're talking about. For the other Torger and Thuri Bakken descendants that may see this video at a later time, I also know or remember seeing these members of my extended family. Ted Whalen, his wife Esther, and their children Tom and Kathy Whalen. He is the son of the oldest daughter, the one born in Norway, Margit Bakken. And even though they lived on the same block we did in Richfield, Minnesota, and I knew them very well. I never met his mother. I don't know if she ever came to Richfield. I wasn't aware of it, or not sure when she died even. So I met them, and I knew 3 of the sons of Tilde Bakken Fridland. And that's a picture right there of the 2 youngest. Oh, you saw it for a while. That's Tilde and Anna. This is a picture of my great aunt Tilde. She was the youngest of the children, born last. And those are 3 of her sons. They had 4 sons. And maybe you could move on to the next picture. That's the family. And then to the right is her husband, who's officially known as Clarence. I never knew that was his name. I just always knew him as Skeeters. And those are their 4 sons. There's Tom and Bob, who went by Junior, James, and Richard are their names.
Skeeters did a marvelous job for us, as you well know, Bernie. And we probably owe to him. He died now about 40 years ago. He was a dear friend of mine and family history. Just wrote very much for us. It was great.
Yeah. Well, Skeeters, like I say, I never knew his name was Clarence. I just figured he was born as was Skeeters, you know. But memories of him always bring a smile to my face, because I saw him several times. They also visited us a couple times over the years when we were living in California. And he had a great sense of humor. And he knew as much about Abraham Lincoln as probably any history professor. He was really a self-educated man. I mean, he didn't go beyond high school. I don't know if he completed high school. Who knows? But I know he was a telegraph operator for the Great Northern Railroad. And they're in Barnesville, where they lived for many years. He was a favorite in my family, and Tilde used to bring a suitcase full of lefse to the Twin Cities during the holidays to share with family members. And those are so fond memories. These days, the last couple of years, I've been ordering lefse from Mrs. Olson's in Gonvick, Minnesota, and they ship it frozen, and I get a big supply of it to last me through December. I remember 3 of Tilde's 4 sons, Robert, who always went by Junior, and his wife, Marcia, and I think their oldest daughter. They had 1, maybe 2 daughters at the time, but I remember they had a daughter. They lived in St. Paul when we were in Richfield, and just a few miles apart. We saw them occasionally. And son Tom and son Jim, I knew them. My family's always honored the fact that all 4 of the Fridland sons put themselves through college. Tilde would sort potatoes in the fall to make money to help pay college costs. And 2 of them became lawyers, I think a 3rd an engineer, and I'm not sure what the 4th occupation was. But, you know, a college degree was more of an achievement in the 1940s, when these boys would have been in school, than it is today, when, you know, you go into a Starbucks and the manager might have a college degree, or someone works in an art store, but you know, it was an accomplishment. And we always thought that was really something that these guys, you know, they weren't from a wealthy family, working class family, but they were able to put, and through the boys' efforts, I know they worked in the summer. One of the boys, I remember He'd go to Alaska and work in the fishing industry up there. And, you know, probably camp out and make a lot of money, enough money in a couple months to support himself through the school year. Finally, I remember Nellie's children, Fred and his wife Lillian. He was a first cousin of my dad's, and we saw them frequently. And Roy Golden, they had their second oldest was Roy. And I remember a daughter, Bernice, and two of her kids, Gail and David Janicki. I've tried to contact them recently, but have been so far unable to do so.
I want to interject briefly there. David Janicki is a plumber, and he installed the stove, the furnace in our house in 1991.
Oh yeah, is it still working?
I haven't lived there for 6 years, but I think it's still
okay.
Yeah.
From some of the interview forms used by the Historical Data Project, I learned the following information. The first church service of the congregation of the Westlands Lutheran Church was held in September 1886 at the home of Andrew Beaver. The first marriage among the pioneer settlers also occurred at the home of Andrew Beaver when Andrew, because he was the groom, Andrew Beaver married Emma, and I'm not sure if it's B-O-S-A-M or B-O-J-A-N or R-N, but again, this
Andy, how is that last name spelled? Do you know?
Well, it's either...
Yeah, it's B-O-S-A-A-N.
Okay, so pronounce what, Bosan?
Yeah, Bosane.
Bosane, okay.
Yeah.
So that was the first marriage, and that was in 1880. Another tidbit from the History Project is that the siblings of Thuri Bakken listed as neighbors were Thuri's sisters. And I showed you that map there, but they were described on the interview form as Mrs. Paul Tastad and Mrs. Pete Gilje. I think this was in the time when all married women were just Mrs. to their husband. Their names weren't mentioned, but Paul told us who they were. And this again illustrates the family connections among the Bakken, Tastad, and Gilje families. As I mentioned at the beginning, almost all the information that I've gathered about my extended family and ancestors has come from Paul Gilje. And a little story here, Paul was unknown to me until I received a letter from him in, I think it was July of 2021. And if you're like me, you receive a lot of junk mail, right? And I know when I go through the mail at the door, half of it never makes it too far into the house before it's discarded. And I looked at this letter. It was it had an envelope that was hand addressed. It had a first-class stamp that somebody actually applied, and had a return address from Minnesota. So it got my curiosity, and I opened it. His opening words were to the effect that he was a second cousin. Paul was a second cousin to my dad, who he named, and explained the connection between us. That began my relationship with Paul and my discovery of the Bakken family and connecting with a few cousins I never knew existed. He told me about an extended family reunion held back in 1976 and the plans to hold a 50th anniversary of that reunion in 2026. Now, keep in mind, this was 2021. And I'm thinking, this guy's a second cousin of my dad. My dad died he died young, but he died about 50 years ago. And how could this guy be a second cousin? So I asked him, I said, Paul, let me ask you, if you don't mind, how old are you? And I forget, he either said 83 or 84. And I said, and you're planning something 5 years from now? I said, I'm 75. I don't plan anything more than about a year and a half. Of course, I'm 79 now, so I made it that far. As we exchanged emails and spoke by phone, he sent me a PDF document of a booklet on the various branches of the family, Giljes, Tastads, etc., and a list of the descendants for each branch that was complete, detailed up to about 1986. As I scanned the Bakken descendants, and I found that all the names and dates of my immediate family and information about my grandmother's siblings and their children, all of this was correct, as far as I knew, down to the names of my first 3 children born before 1986. Had my wife's name down there, had my brother's wife's name. I mean, I thought, who is this guy? But it just, it showed you the effort that he's in others. I'm sure he'd say he didn't do that all on his own. I found this to be amazing. So I want to credit Paul for his amazing work in helping me discover a part of my family, and for his efforts, for his amazing work to bring this reunion project to where it is today, and to have a chance to meet some of you. So that ends my prepared remarks. I'm going to turn it back over to Paul and see.
Well, thank you, Bernie. Let's see if any of you have questions at all. Joe and Carolyn Martinetti, you got you're still on mute, but maybe you can get unmuted. Yeah, hi, Joe. Frederica, you might have a question or a comment.
It's very interesting, all these interconnections of families. Thank you, Bernie.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure. I was sweating this for a long time because Paul kept asking me, you about ready? I goes, I don't know. And then I finally just started working on it probably 2 months ago, and little bit by little bit, it kind of came together when I realized that narrative biography was so familiar to a lot of people. And I just thought it would make a good way to try to tell the story.
Carolyn and Joe, do you have a question or a comment?
Can't think of any right now.
You had 3 more slides there on your presentation. Looks like one of them is the church, and that we have.
Oh yeah, those were slides from I think from Norway, right? Wasn't that, you said one of those? There was a picture of a church where Thuri was baptized, Paul.
Yeah. That's up in Bickler. Yes.
Can you show us 17, 18, and 19? There we go.
Oh yeah, we didn't show these. So Paul knows about this one.
Yeah. So here, this one is slightly repetitious. It's 1975 too, and shows Tildy and Anna and Lena.
Yeah, that's Lincoln. Actually, I think it's Anna, Tildy, and my grandma I know is the one on the far right.
Yeah.
Supposedly it says Tildy, Anna, and Lena in front of Colbine. Maybe that's the current owner. I don't know if that's their house or does anybody know Colbine, where they fit in?
This is Skeeter's writing.
Okay.
And Skeeter was fascinated by the name Colbine, which repeats itself many times in the history of the Bakken family in Norway.
Okay.
Colbine was very popular, and often when Skeeter would send a memo to me about any of the family, he would go out of his way to use the Colbine ancestors as kind of a common name. Thank you for bringing that up. I had forgotten about that. And this one is shows Torger, or his other name, which we can't pronounce, Torger and a co-worker in 1912 in a farm wagon. And what they were doing, this picture was in the 1986 family book, as was the previous picture. And then the Bickler Church, where Thuri was baptized. And I'm not sure if TK was, because TK came from Vala, which is south of Bickla. And so he might have been baptized at the Vala Church rather than there.
Hey, Paul.
Yeah.
I do have a kind of a question. I was just, when I saw 1912, I was just curious. Do you know of any of the relatives that might have served in World War I?
It's past. I don't know, but that question came up, this week around our coffee table at Orchard Path, where I live, as all us old folks. And I don't know if any of them did. And so, and it never was mentioned, never has been mentioned at all in any of our connections that World War II, yes, very definitely. And in 1912, there would have been Torsen was born in 1890, so he was 22 then. Yeah, 22 would be his oldest. Or 1918, he would have been 28. The one thing about him, his father was dead by 1916. He died in 1915, and he might have been needed to work the farm. I'm not sure of that, but that's just another factor. And by 1912, Paul Tastad and Andrew were old enough to have served in World War II. World War I. I don't know. Very good question. We'll have to explore.
I might have
see if anybody knows.
I believe,
Joe.
I think my grandmother told me that her brother Knut Bakken had served in World War I.
Mhm.
He was born, I just checked my notes. He was born.
Poor Knut.
He would have been,
He would have been old enough.
20, he would have been about 24 then or something. I don't know. That would probably be ripe age for.
Knut was born in 1893. Yes. So Knut, interestingly, spent his last years at Jamestown State Hospital. Poor Knut was.
Well, I had heard something to the effect that he had today, I guess they used to call it shell shock. Today they say post-traumatic stress disorder, but there was something, I think it was connected with the war, but I don't know, but he certainly was old enough to have.
William's parents might know that.
The war went in Europe from 1914 to 18, but the United States didn't enter it until 1917, I believe.
Right, yeah.
Ted, I'll call you back. The PTSD thing would seem consistent. I visited Knut with my mother in Jamestown at least once. My mom was concerned, because Knut was her cousin. Other questions or comments? Very good. Sib and Randy, any
Great job.
comments?
Great job. And Paul is Paul is certainly a great author. He's also a little stalker, but that's okay. I'm glad he got through to you in 2021.
Yeah, it surprised me. I almost was on the verge of throwing it away, and I thought, well, wait a second. This is hand addressed, and it's a stamp. It's not out of a meter machine or something. And I thought, Minnesota, maybe I should open this.
Good thing.
Thank you, Bernie. Very nice of you. Arne Østebo from Gilje, Norway. You have any thoughts this afternoon?
Just that it must have been very good genes in the Bakkens.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
We'll see.
Interesting to hear. Yeah.
Okay. Frederica? Joe and Carolyn, any further thoughts, comments?
I think I'm gonna email you some questions about the veteran stuff.
Please do that. Please do that. Because I presume a person could check in the U.S. government records, couldn't one? To see who might have served in World War I?
Yeah, I'm sure we could.
I think that's.
Yeah,
I think it's worth investigating. Right. Okay. By the way, it occurred to me when Bernie was spending the time he was on the Writers Project that it would be productive if some of us were curious about checking other families that we aren't involved with. And so I, on some others sharing, and let me just give this to you before we leave. I don't know, is this readable? It's not necessary for you to look at it. Can you read this?
We can't see it.
I don't see, we just see our faces.
Okay,
See you.
you can see me. What I'm showing you isn't even showing up.
No, you're not
Well,
sure.
let me- when we discovered the North Dakota family histories, it was so fascinating to us because so many of them are concluded. And even in now, Randy, you've seen the Beaver family bio, haven't you?
I've seen Andrew Beaver's 1930s interview. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, that's the one we're talking about, right? Yeah,
Yes.
that's exactly similar to TK's. And then
Right.
in addition to that, people whose names show up in connection with our families: Chervestead, Ingebrigtsen, Leonard, Lundy, Shipstead, Tweeten, Vetris, all of those show up. And I tell the list in Dakota, in Rolette County alone, is over 100. So
wow.
over 100 separate interviews were done in Rolette County alone. All of them are available at the North Dakota Historical Society. They'll send you a PDF copy for your computer for $5. It's just a marvelous piece of work. And I have in my personal copy right on my own computer, the Bakken, Beaver, Ingebrigtsen, Chervestead, Leonard, Lundy, Shipstead, Tweeten, and Vetris ones, and would be happy to send those to you for nothing. So if any of you is interested in that, just let me know and we'll send them off. But I wanted to get that on the recording this afternoon because you never can tell.
Yeah.
Well, and what's interesting is like his referred to Randy's family, Andrew Beaver's house, that some of the family still lives there today, where the first service was held and the wedding was held and stuff. So you don't know what other families mentioned, and you can hear about, the crops and the stuff that even if it's not your family, it's what they were also going through. So
very good, because Sid points out a very good point that not only are these personal biographies, but they write down the names of the members of their church, who they were. They write down the names of their friends and indicate on a map of the township where they lived, and names of business people. So it's very, very thorough. Yes. Okay. Any further comments?
Yeah. One last thing before you go, Paul, and everybody else can have if you give a 60-second update on where we are with that statue that you're putting together.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Mhm.
We have received preliminary gifts, pledges totaling $13,800 from the first 16 people. And our plan is that we will mention that in a letter that will go out to everybody within the next week or so. We've been holding off because we have a way to send checks, but we figure people might prefer to use electronic means of transferring money. So we're providing a transfer, I think it's going to be a PayPal. I'm not positive, but the treasurer is working on that, and she's going to get that out. So I've been very pleased with the response so far. Thanks, Randy. Just great. And thank you for your advance. That's great. We've been very, very very pleased with the results. And then they will get going on the sculpture itself. Okay. Further comments, questions? Okay, I think Randy or Bernie, have you got any more footnotes to mention?
I have some notes that I didn't add in. They're kind of part of these. It's not part of the biography, but there's information on the church and cemetery, and in that information you sent me, it's all part of those handwritten things. Some of the professional people in the area and people that were in the early schools and stuff.
Okay, yeah, that's in the 1930s document. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, we'll indicate on the memo we send out that a complete copy of the 1930s document we can send them via PDF to anybody who wants it. So that's good. Okay, are we about done? Thank you, Bernie. You really worked hard.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Your your
Thank
friends.
you.
I know he did because he
My
was on his
pleasure.
fourth or fifth time. So thanks so much for checking in and have a good day. We'll see you all. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey,
Good.
Bye.
ha det bra.